In one of my last videos, I had investigated the philosophy of Marcuse. Since then, I have gone deeper into understanding his philosophical thinking and reflecting on the ideas presented there, especially on two themes: American affluent totalitarianism and the existential condition of work. I feel that Marcuse is a rather overlooked thinker in today's political climate, especially given that the left today thinks of themselves as the descendants of the 60s. Progressives see themselves as building upon women's suffrage, civil rights and labor unions. They tell us they are the ones making life better for the oppressed and are the bulwark against fascism. Yet they have lost much of the countercultural direction and back to basic asceticism of the hippies. The major democratic politicians are not saying much about a productivity-driven culture or the nature of work and labor concerning civil rights. In contrast, left-wing progressives have become the heads of all the major tech corporations, the same ones that have suicide nets at their factories because working conditions are so oppressive. Not only was Marcuse very critical of tech, but he was especially critical of technology aiding a new form of totalitarianism, ones we seem to be quickly adapting to. The affluent society, he called it, where industrially developed post-scarcity society still has us living brutally oppressive lives made palatable by consumerism, where totalitarianism manifests through non-terroristic forms of coordination in advanced industrial society.
Now, by a totalitarian, I use the term fully aware that this might violate certain taboos. We are used to apply the term totalitarian only to, well, first the fascist and Nazi society, then the communist society. That is to say, we are used to apply the term totalitarian to societies under a more or less terroristic dictatorship, with a one-party system, with the more or less terroristic elimination of all opposition. I believe that such a confined, restricted use of the term totalitarian is itself ideological, because it may serve to cover up the fact, at least in my opinion, a fact that totalitarian tendencies are beginning to show even in societies which are still democratic, which preserve the democratic process and institutions, which have several parties, which may even have countervailing forces. By totalitarian, I mean the constellation or situation in which the private as well as public existence of man, of the individual, is controlled, is exposed to standardized, required ways of behavior, standardized imposed values, standardized imposed needs. This can be done by a private as well as by a public bureaucracy. It can be done via the perfectly democratic media of mass communication and so on. It is in a way a consequence, as the quote shows, of technical progress, which implies mass production and mass distribution. Mass production and mass distribution in turn require a considerable degree of standardization, a considerable degree of the submission of the individual to pre-given and superimposed values, ideas, aspirations, goals, and so on.
Operates by manipulating individual needs and desires, effectively precluding the emergence of an effective opposition against the system. We have seen how tech has become increasingly totalitarian, and we have experienced how easily we allow ourselves to be under constant surveillance, not by the state, but by business. Facebook, Google, Apple, and Amazon all collect our data, process our habits in algorithms, and creep into all avenues of our lives. Where I go to church or spend my leisure time, and what foods I buy are all part of a totalitarian system. One that does not feel oppressive because it benefits me as well, but one which nonetheless is pervasive and seeks to use that data to control some of our behavior, such as buying decisions, the manipulation of information, and the manipulation of my desires to serve things which are not in my own interests. The promise of tech since Keynes was that scientific efficiency and automation would free us from difficult, mundane labor, the way a dishwasher and laundry machine have given us added time and energy. As Marcuse explains, this was supposed to lead us to new kinds of freedom, where we no longer had to sell our labor to the highest bidder desperately and be alienated from our own labor by toiling in mundane activities which we had no control over or self-determination in.
If the individual were no longer compelled to prove himself on the market as a free economic subject, the disappearance of this kind of freedom would be one of the greatest achievements of civilization. The technological processes of mechanization and standardization might release individual energy into a yet uncharted realm of freedom beyond necessity. The very structure of human existence would be altered. The individual would be liberated from the work worlds imposing upon him alien needs and alien possibilities. The individual would be free to exert autonomy over a life that would be his own. If the productive apparatus could be organized and directed toward the satisfaction of the vital needs, its control might well be centralized. Such control would not prevent individual autonomy, but render it possible. This is a goal within the capabilities of advanced industrial civilization, the end of technological rationality. In actual fact, however, the contrary trend operates. The apparatus imposes its economic and political requirements for defense and expansion on labor time and free time, on the material and intellectual culture. By virtue of the way it has organized its technological base, contemporary industrial society tends to be totalitarian. For totalitarian is not only a terroristic political coordination of society, but also a non-terroristic economic technical coordination which operates through the manipulation of needs by vested interests. It thus precludes the emergence of an effective opposition against the whole. Not only a specific form of government or party rule makes for totalitarianism, but also a specific system of production and distribution which may well be compatible with a pluralism of parties, newspapers, countervailing powers, etc.
The left in America during the 60s was supposed to be the opposition to this totalitarianism, one which also became destructive in how it used American production to create a global war machine, expanding markets and using productivity to destructive ends. The counterculture, the hippies, were seeking new modes of existence, new lifestyles which were not consumer-based or living the life of a corporate drone. They were protesting the oppressiveness of this machine, and Marcuse was at the time considered the father of this new left. I would like to explore how the left has lost the spirit of the 60s and been pursuing side quests rather than its original charisma and purpose, and why Marxism is seeing a revitalization in America, appealing more than ever to a new generation, a generation born into this affluent society. When we examine the crisis of meaning today, much of it focuses around the loss of religion, or more traditional patterns of life like having a family. Yet the issue of labor is no small part of someone's life. It's what you will do for 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week for most of your life. If you experience your labor as oppressive and alienating, this can be dehumanizing. This is a much bigger civil rights issue than LGBTQ+ issues, since those affect in the United States around 5.5%. This is equivalent to about 13.9 million LGBT adults in the country, while labor consumes a massive proportion of the population's attention, energy, and willpower, not to mention, of course, time. A disproportionate amount of intellectual resources is being spent discussing gender issues and deconstructing gender, rather than is spent writing on or researching the nature of work or deconstructing our traditional social constructs of work, what our work functions achieve in our lives and society, and what purpose work has or should have. It is not a daily issue for me if men are using the women's bathroom, nor is totalitarianism have the misuse of pronouns as central to its functioning. While almost everyone works every day and does so in situations where many consider what they do to be meaningless but necessary, a large proportion of the population struggles with depression, a sense of meaning, and having friendships and relationships, far greater than those who make up the 5% of the LGBTQ community, while that community too are affected by labor issues and the psychological effects they have. Where and with who you spend 8 hours of your waking day, what you are doing and why you are doing it affects everyone. I included willpower into what working costs because of how much more difficult hobbies and passion projects can be to attend to after a day's work. Few people are able to put in 8 hours a day, then go home and grind on some skill like writing, painting, practicing music, or similar such projects which, although maybe passions, still require discipline and gumption. This can leave many people's lives being stripped down to working all day, being too tired to do anything else when they get home, slugging through a few chores, going to bed, and repeating this process all in anticipation of a weekend or some holiday. Automation and efficiency were supposed to alleviate this. Is it any wonder then that Marxism would have the appeal to so many of the youth the way it does today? What meaning is there in a life like this? Then combine that with the loss of religion and the increasing reduction in marriage and birth. Labor being such a large aspect of one's life, it can be transformed into a sacrifice or responsibility to be carried for a greater good, when connected to providing for a family or being part of some divine plan to build God's kingdom. But it can also compound the suffering of having neither when it lacks connection to meaningful relationships or adds no sense of purpose to life itself. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian writer and dissident who often conveyed the horrors of the Soviet labor camp system, the Gulag, in his works, notably in the Gulag Archipelago, wrote when describing what hell could be like, that it would be much like the Gulags, where you would be required to carry sandbags from one part of the camp, then when done, carry them back to the original spot, then do it all over again. The point is that meaningless toil was used as a form of torture in Soviet Russia, that expending the best of one's potential into something which does not make the world or your life or the lives of those you love better compounds the existential agony of just wasting your potential. The concept of meaningless work as a form of hell, as a kind of spiritual and psychological torment. In his view, when human beings are stripped of their ability to see purpose or value in their efforts, they experience a form of dehumanization. For prisoners in the Gulag, this meaningless labor was often a deliberate tool of oppression, designed not just to exhaust them physically, but to break them mentally and spiritually. The work was often futile or absurd, such as digging holes and filling them back up, or tasks where no visible progress was made. This, to Solzhenitsyn, embodied a kind of existential despair where the absence of meaning made life itself feel unbearable. He conveys that the worst form of punishment is not just suffering, but suffering for no purpose. In this sense, the forced, purposeless labor in the camps represented a hellish existence, a slow destruction of the individual's spirit. Solzhenitsyn believed that when work is stripped of meaning, it becomes a tool for erasing human dignity and identity, reducing people to mere cogs in a senseless machine. This notion of forced labor without meaning becomes, in Solzhenitsyn's writing, a metaphor for a greater spiritual and societal hell under totalitarianism. Marcuse fled Nazi Germany and fascism, but observed that fascism was not necessary in America. It had created a new form of totalitarianism which did not need the explicit force and violence of fascism to control people. Marcuse sees the affluent life as concealing many of the same practices as totalitarianism in breaking humans down, but more gently with a velvet glove, that it succeeds because it is better able to remain hidden and palatable. And whereas consumerism is just more painkillers to the meaninglessness this mode of existence generates, stating,
Those whose life is the hell of the affluent society are kept in line by a brutality which revives medieval and early modern practices. For the other, less underprivileged people, society takes care of the need for liberation by satisfying the needs which make servitude palatable and perhaps even unnoticeable, and it accomplishes this fact in the process of production itself.
Work is fundamental to human dignity and a core aspect of meaning generation. Work is a large part of how we experience meaning in our lives. Although we may fantasize about living on an island drinking piña coladas, that will not last as a long-term solution. Nor does it play out that having everything taken care of means everyone will be lazy. The richest people have the busiest schedules, Elon Musk or Hillary Clinton, They have every reason to sit on an island all day, yet they are constantly working more than most 9-to-5 employees have the stamina for. Trump should have retired long ago, yet despite 2 assassination attempts, seems to thrive on the workload he is under. Lack of money can do the quite opposite of motivating a person. It can make one a defeatist, lacking the resilience that comes from having resources and the sense of power, freedom and autonomy which accompany surplus income. It becomes easier to allow oneself to spiral when working seems futile in changing one's situation. A meaninglessness not in the work itself, but in any effect the work has on one's life can break a person. If the work is also itself is experienced as meaningless in its purpose, that further demotivates a person, not necessarily laziness.
In a 2013 survey of 12,000 professionals by the Harvard Business Review, half said they felt their job had no meaning and significance, and an equal number were unable to relate to their company's mission, while another poll, among 230,000 employees in 142 countries, showed that only 13% of workers actually like their job. A recent poll among Brits revealed that as many as 37% think they have a job that is utterly useless.
We can look at video games as an example of how even escapist leisure ends up being filled with quests, missions, upgrades, and new skills. It comes to resemble virtual work. Games, too, need meaning, and the rules are there to generate meaning and for the game to happen. Fun needs to be structured within a set of rules like football or soccer, cards or gambling. There must be something to achieve or do, even if it is frivolous like killing the most aliens. Frivolous meaning is still meaning, and perhaps some of the most important kind, since by being frivolous it implicitly reveals that meaning is enjoyable itself, and that non-frivolous meaning exists, which is something reassuring and renewing in and of itself to be reminded of. In this way, fun is a kind of jouissance, in the goodness of the inescapable meaning of existence itself, where it is revealed that existence is not meaningless, but that meaning is always present in some small way in the small pleasures of existence itself, that existence is always trying to give itself to receive meaningfulness. The Freudian pleasure principle is always at work in our psyche, but also that existence is fundamentally giving itself erotically, seeking to be loved and enjoyed. The smell of flowers, the colors of sunset, the light through trees, and the most common repetitive daily goods are analogously already filled with erotic meaning, the kind poets cultivate in their discipline of metaphors and sounds, giving a meta-meaning to profane words as profound music, and the civilizing force of music as derived from savage nature. This jouissance and erotic poetry of life, too, is something totalitarianism strips from life. The mechanized, formulating scientific efficiency of advanced industrial society keeps us alienated from the erotic goodness of existence. Totalitarian America only allows us to experience this erotic aspect of life in genital-focused pleasure. The rest of the time, we must suppress our jouissance to maintain the social order and productivity.
While any form of the reality principle demands a considerable degree and scope of repressive control over the instincts, additional controls arising from the specific institutions of domination are what we denote as surplus repression. For example, the modifications and deflections of instinctual energy necessitated by the perpetuation of the monogamic patriarchal family, by a hierarchical division of labor, or by public control of the individual's private existence are instances of surplus repression pertaining to the institutions of a particular reality principle.
It's an old Freudian theme he builds on from civilization and its discontents, one which has been criticized by conservatives for including patriarchal monogamy in this suppression. I would argue patriarchy was more the bone of contention for him rather than monogamy. The male domination of monogamy is what made it a superfluous rather than the regular repression we must exercise over our instincts daily, which monogamy can satisfy. However, I think he's being intentionally open-ended. Regardless, Marcuse lived during the hippies and witnessed firsthand the hippie free love stuff. He did not endorse it or promote it as an alternative. He saw it as superficial and warned further that without a critical consciousness and a broader political agenda, the movement for free love could be absorbed into the consumer culture of capitalism, where freedom becomes just another product. This is precisely what happened. Hugh Hefner sold promiscuity as sophisticated to generate advertising space, and Vogue sold it as women's liberation to sell cigarettes and makeup. In this sense, his critique was that the hippie movement, though radical in some ways, might ultimately fall short of achieving the more profound liberation he envisioned, which required liberation from commodified genitalia-centric libido, the kind which furthers repression in society through the desublimation of the libido into consumer products. Desire is constricted in its impulsive release. It is not allowed to be alchemized with our dreams and hopes and our imagination, to become personalized and enrich desires. Free love as an alternative to patriarchal domination was in fact absorbed into the instant gratification of consumerism that its impulsive gratification was all too compatible with, commodified with porn and a sex-positive feminism industry. The global sex tech, that is sex toy market, is estimated at $42 billion. OnlyFans is worth $6 billion, while the NFL is worth $20 billion. The global porn industry is estimated to be worth $97 billion. Free love is the most capitalistic behavior now. These technologies further focus all our libidinal energy into genitally focused libidinal experiences, with all other aspects of life being a sublimation of pleasure into the social order and into productivity. Our libidinal energy is not liberated under these conditions. It is restricted, commodified, and sublimated. Sex is the prize of making it to the top of the consumer social order through years of repression for the sake of productivity. Meanwhile, our civic design is made for the efficiency of cars and subways, subterranean travel in artificial metal tubes, or urban streets filled with commerce advertisements propagandizing to us incessantly that we need more money to buy new pleasures. The billboards blocking out the sunsets, the roads having no place for the fields of sunflowers or lilies a pre-industrial peasant would have passed. We pay to go to parks so that nature is commodified and reframed as a privilege, like we are exiles from Eden who must pay for our birthright. Anyone who lived in or visited an aesthetic country like Italy, France, or South America experiences instantly as a culture shock this erotic jouissance of daily life. The overgrown vines, the flowers everywhere, the smell of lavender, the need to walk, the forced breaks, and the attention to the beautification of small things. The smells and the importance of refining a flavor or design as itself incredibly meaningful. While in America, these free pleasures are replaced with consumer goods. Rather than sit at a cafe or piazza in front of a statue, reading Rambo for an hour for the price of an espresso, I need to go into a movie theater and pay $20 for the ticket and $15 for the popcorn to watch the newest Rambo 7. My leisure is atomized. I won't meet anyone beyond a light banter with the clerk. There aren't fountains to sketch or buskers to hear play a song and smile at. All leisure is passive and commodified, nor does it originate organically or from the grassroots of the community. It is colonized in my community from Hollywood or New York. There is no local color, local wine, local art style or cuisine. Instead, there are homogenized strip malls with homogenized chain restaurants and homogenized entertainment. Certainly there are efforts to fight this. The hipsters had a good run. And bigger cultural hubs like New York and Chicago have their districts and burgs with personality. But these are the exceptions. They are famous because of this, and why people move to big cities. And local culture can be sought out in other places. In the suburbs, one can search out an authentic Mexican or Greek restaurant, or find a tavern with live music. But all of this is bourgeoisie. Organic culture is a luxury good like organic food at Whole Foods. Organic excludes rather than includes. While homogenized corporate culture, the kind produced by the culture industry, is the proletarian culture. The material comforts and pleasures only aid in making life palatable under these conditions, but the laborers remain unsatisfied with how they are required to expend their energies, talents, time, and willpower, to the point that a soft form of slavery is felt as a prevalent condition. Nor do I think that it's fair to discard this as hyperbolic, as many ardent defenders of capitalism do. If work is important, if labor gives you dignity, then the degradation of labor is experienced as a degradation of oneself in what value they have. Certainly there are many forms of work which are indisputably degrading in themselves. Despite, for example, the push to normalize sex work, many still reflexively see something dehumanizing about it. The act of forcing your will to engage in erotic behavior with someone you're either not attracted to or positively repulsed by is a loss of something inexplicable, but more than what exploitive yet otherwise bearable labor would take from you.
Must be quite a change from Hollywood Boulevard, huh?
What?
Yeah, Edward told me. Hey, don't worry, your secret is safe with me. Listen, maybe you and I could get together sometime after Edward leaves.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Well, then we'll just have to do that, huh?
I choose sex work as my example because for something to be degrading, it is usually agreed on that it must be something we wouldn't do by our own choice. Or if we had the liberty to do otherwise, we would reject. Degrading work then seems to be work where we are coerced into it, either by a terrible situation or threat. Sex trafficking is indisputably one such situation. However, sex work becomes more fuzzy due to this aspect of doing it by choice. Most agree that consent is the key aspect to this distinction, and many arguments are given about consent, and if there is consent, then it's legit. The problem with consent is that it doesn't make some act moral even if it's legal. Someone dying of a terminal disease could consent to being killed at a price in order to give the money to my family. Suicide by cop has unfortunately been used by those who wish to die, but where no such service is available by the market. Or one could consent to be a slave for a period of time for financial gain, or as was done in the ancient world, to pay off debt. Neither of these seems to be made moral just because consent is given. These are rather easy hypotheticals that don't happen in the real world, or if they did, then not as a regular part of our lives. So we shall use sex work instead as our example in exploring consent as a basis for work. Maybe legally it could be argued in the case of porn actresses or legal brothels that this is dignified sex work. Regardless, consent is the determining factor, but is it sufficient? First off, from a left-wing perspective, due to inequalities in a contract, just because I consent to a contract doesn't mean I can functionally do otherwise. My desperation, the intensity of need I have, as well as information, experience, assertiveness, and simple worldly cunning may allow me to concede rather than consent. The porn star Mia Khalifa had expressed in an interview, asking her why she made the movies she did if she now is so opposed to the industry. In other words, if she consented, why is she complaining? And she gave a seemingly weak but still telling answer. It would be like getting up from a dinner at a restaurant. I think we can all relate to this in some way, where many times I want to leave some event early, but don't want to be that guy, the one who caves to social pressure. And this seems to be a common tactic in the industry, girls showing up for one thing and corn through coercion and pressure into another. I say weak in order to highlight the problem with consent. If social pressure, awkwardness, eye glances, and fear of being disliked make it difficult for you to leave social circumstances that your will and intellect are in concert with acting against, are you fit to consent to contracts using those forces against you? The libertarians would answer, yes, and would point out that it's your problem, you're weak, you are still free. But that's precisely the point. Weak people don't enter legal contracts equally, and there is a disbalance of strength which is being exploited, so what is legal may not necessarily be free of exploitation, and willful exploitation is questionable in its moral content. While from a more conservative perspective, we can say some work, by the objectivity of what it is, should not be done. Sex work would be one such type of work where the act itself, the act of selling sex outside of marriage, is objectively problematic, since sex is part of a larger social act of building a family. While if bought and sold, it will be destructive to the cornerstone of society, the creation and maintaining of families. So in lack of a simpler example, sex work gives, I think, an obviously problematic form of work from both sides of the political spectrum. But what I also hope to have established is that consent is not a sufficient criterion for the legitimacy of work, given that one can quite openly and freely consent to something which, from a conservative perspective, is immoral. One can also legally consent to something which, interiorly, they lack the resources to do so freely from a liberal perspective. It's only within a consumer mindset perspective that one can see such a situation as creating more freedom. I should be able to consume whatever I want as long as the other party consents. Operating only as a consumer corrupts our introspection into the nature of liberty, one that refuses to acknowledge a framework of liberty where one should not need to commodify sex, and where the need to commodify sex is already a loss of freedom. They have already been put into a situation like consenting to slavery, a situation where consent has been reframed to benefit the consumer. Social status and economics are almost always involved in sex work, and these conditions change the ability to enter into a contract as an equal. From both these perspectives, then, I hope to establish that labor can be degrading to the laborer even if consent is present. But beyond being a form of labor which is degrading, sex work is arguably a non-productive form of labor. And this brings us to Marcuse's point about the problems with capitalism. We exist in a time where more than ever, the body does not need to be an instrument of labor. With industrialization, much of what was physically burdensome labor has been replaced by machines, factory labor, for example. And with that, the hope of a higher quality of lifestyle than what was experienced when Marx had observed the factories in England. Much of labor has become intellectual rather than physical, tech jobs, for example. Further, we would expect that the quality of labor would improve by what it produces. We would think now that menial tasks had been automated in factory work, people would go on to find new forms of labor which were free from drudgery. However, that has not been the case. With the surpluses of material goods being produced, there has arisen a need for surplus needs. I no longer need shoes. I need shoes which indicate status or taste. Even antiques have striven to master time through consumption. Vintage is often as much about a feel as it is about quality, so that vintage video games like Super Mario Bros. 3 in a sealbox mint condition go for $1,000. It's not the material product that's being sold, it's not even the game, it's a sensation. This creates the need for new forms of labor, which produce ephemeral sensations in the consumer, rather than a product. My shirt made today can't just be made of high-quality material, it needs to express some quirk, like creating nostalgia about the 80s. It's not enough that a purse be well made, it must convey a feeling of belonging to an elite trend. These kinds of appetites are no longer materially bound and satisfiable, they are infinite. New desires come weekly for products I already possess, but need the latest variation or special edition of. My Jordans aren't the Air Jordan Retro 6 Jordans. The ones I have on literally don't look like my older Jordans from when I was a kid, so my current Jordans no longer satisfy the sense of style they did a week ago. I need an older design style to be in style today because this year's design is not the new style of wearing the old design. This irrationality is part of what keeps the system running. Marcuse states,
And yet this society is irrational as a whole. Its productivity is destructive of the free development of human needs and faculties. Its peace maintained by the constant threat of war. Its growth dependent on the repression of the real possibilities for pacifying the struggle for existence, individual, national, and international.
adding,
The capabilities, intellectual and material, of contemporary society are immeasurably greater than ever before, which means that the scope of society's domination over the individual is immeasurably greater than ever before.
even my soap is never sufficient. Basic cleanliness and hygiene are no longer enough. I need my soap to give me ethical security that it's environmentally friendly and made of natural products. I'm not just cleaning my body like the plebs do, I'm cleaning the environment and my conscience when I bathe. I'm renewing my physiological energies with botanical extracts and infusions. This fetishization of objects with the gratification of psychological needs is generated by marketers. A fetish economy is another act of this desublimation of my libido. I don't seek out physical pleasures directly, like enjoying a day at the park or hiking. I seek out new products which convey a lifestyle of someone who enjoys a day at the park. My product enjoys life for me the way a votive candle prays on my behalf. I replace what's free, a day hiking, with the products that convey the hiking lifestyle and so constrict my libido to objects rather. Then the polymorphic eroticism of walking in nature, hearing birds, seeing flowers, eating berries. All aspects of nature themselves rooted in the reproductive imperative which I suppress myself from encountering. Sublimating that imperative into consumer products. The smallest things like basic soap, which was always natural, undergo fetishization. Industry began producing it from chemicals. And now they tell us we must pay more to not be a basic consumer. a strange kind of consumer hostage-taking of our psychological well-being. Pay more or else feel inferior. The market no longer needs to make enough basic soap for everyone. My material and bodily needs being satisfied, the market endlessly infuses soap with new meanings and purposes that I can buy each economic quarter. And with that, I must continue to work the same hours to buy the psychologically enhanced products, despite the fact that the scaling of industry made making soap cheaper with the hope then that people could work less and still afford a dignified lifestyle. And this hamster wheel repeats. We are not making qualitative improvements, we are engaged in infinite quantitative changes. iPhone 12, then 13 gets a bigger camera, then 14 gets more megapixels and so on. The same phone, the same lifestyle, the same work hours, the same lack of energy for hobbies and friends, the same mental box I'm thinking and desiring within.
Weber's Iron Cage in a way, a little bit.
Oh, yeah,
there.
it's
Like
perfect.
we can't even think outside. Like there is no such thing as outside the box thinking. Anything that we even posit as outside the box thinking is actually still under the dominant discourse of advanced industrial society, and its ideological purview, capitalism or republicanism or whatever it might be. Like those. There is nothing. There's nothing outside the box.
No matter how much you make, no matter how much you work, you will always lack some consumer good. There is no satisfaction of needs because the products produced are not made to satisfy your human needs. They are made to create new appetites, new insecurities, new fears, new inadequacies, which can then be fixed with a new product. You could probably go to Costco to buy a year's supply of all the amenities you need. Soap, laundry detergent, coffee, rice, shampoo, toothpaste, etc. Then go to Goodwill and buy a year's wardrobe and many of your supplies like sheets, curtains, dishes, utensils, office supplies, bags and what have you. Then work 30% less for the year, but you will lose social status if not in everyone else's eyes, then in your own insofar as how marketers are telling you you look in everyone else's eyes. You won't have this season's trends. You won't have a Starbucks in hand, or you won't know what all the buzz is about with the latest mug. That if your house burns down and all the places your childhood memories happen are lost, that mug will remain. And this is just in regards to chasing trends. As the economy has become more efficient, we aren't working less, we just buy more. We produce more, but what produces more transient. Yet none of this is productive or production. Very little is being produced that we don't already have, just newer and more expensive forms with added fetishization value. The sex industry is in many senses the model template for a consumer economy. A natural need which could and should be satisfied outside of commerce is commodified, and what is sold doesn't produce long-term satiation. It creates new desires for new varieties. There is a famous gerbil experiment, where a male gerbil got loose in a female cage and almost killed himself enjoying the variety of females available to him. This is what marketers want to do with every product they advertise, endless variety and novelty for endless appetites. I can't imagine, for example, if all porn production was stopped today, that there wouldn't be enough porn already created to fulfill any need one might claim it fulfills. We don't need to make a minute more of it, yet it's in high production. So what are we producing? And is any of what we're producing increasing our lifestyle standard? Further, isn't porn just a perpetuation itself of the system that creates one-dimensional man? It satiates without satisfying. It permits the user to endure life without changing it. It alienates them from community and commodifies the user as well. The actors even on free sites as data to be sold to advertisers, and so perpetuates the further manipulation of a bad situation for profit. It's part of the process of de-sublimation, where one acts out their impulsive urges and so contracts one's desires. One does not know what they desire. They consume what the machine and analytics says their demographics should want, creating a feedback loop where one's desires are not reflected back to them but suppressed while a machine tells them what to desire. A stimulus is fed to them, which they, in an act of depreciated self-control, consume rather than create or generate from their own imagination, and they condition themselves to this stimulus until it becomes an internalized neuropathway for an instinctual imperative. Meanwhile, their real desires are alienated from the consumer and suppressed. The male who would have liked the cute blonde girl working at the grocery store now has unwittingly created strong neuropathways from hyper-stimulated dominee hits, given by heavily modified Instagram models, who themselves are the product of algorithms saying this is what men desire, a product of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Men socialize a desire for women. The algorithm says their demographic desire. So the women try to be those women, so men desire them. But all of that process of structuring desire was intermediated by a machine, one organized by incentives for selling products and advertising attention. Meanwhile, the cute blonde at the grocery store, who with a few conversations could have organically become a sexual fantasy of the male and became a desire he put his dreams and values into, imagining life with her, being in love with, having intimacy with. A three-dimensional desire formed around a real person he sees daily has now been contracted to a two-dimensional image, flattened to an impulse. His desire has been de-sublimated and commercially re-socialized for a kind of woman who is invented to sell products. And the cute blonde, if she wants to attract him, needs to take on the look and persona of this algorithmically generated form of femininity developed to sell advertising time. If I must work the same hours as my grandpa and I have seen no increase in leisure time, then one must hope that at least the labor which I engage in has become qualitatively better or more meaningful. But the production of these goods produces more meaningless forms of work. Bullshit jobs have proliferated capitalist economies in much the same way bureaucratic jobs proliferate socialist economies. Bullshit jobs, a phenomenon written about by David Graeber, show that the efficiency of the free market is still exceptionally irrational. Vanity and ritualistic customs lead to the hiring of toddies, well-dressed retainers who improve the appearance of prestige for the higher-ups. Corporate lawyers are kept in-house, rather than hired out as needed due to the litigation games corporations play with each other. Patent trolling becomes a full-time job, as does planned obsolescence. PR people who duct tape over problems rather than fix them, and endless protocols for paperwork are thought up. This is another kind of problematic labor. Useless jobs, these are jobs which are not productive. There was, for example, a period when YouTuber girls were selling bathwater and their farts in jars. The fact that there is a market and consumer for it does not make it a productive form of labor, but instead highlights one of the problems of a market economy. It is not an economy of production, it's an economy of consumption. Value is determined by market value, that is, appetites within a consumer. Market value is not social value. Vice goods are always in high demand, and the consumer today is in a constant battle with addictive products, even their own food. Lobbyist manipulates the science for those trying to be informed. Marketers use Freudian psychology to talk to you subconsciously. And the wording and phasing of products hide the amount of undesirable ingredients that are present. So even a conscious consumer thinks they're eating healthy but has no idea they were outwitted by a sophisticated graphic designer. Proprietary blend means not telling what is in it or how much. While the stores themselves use all manner of tricks to upsell you on some product and invoke impulse buys. So controlling your diet becomes a secondary job, evident by the weight epidemic in America. None of this is productive, none of this is qualitative progress towards more liberated forms of life. Nor are these our desires, these are more impulses constricting desire. Qualitative change is something this form of totalitarianism is effective at preventing. The revolution becomes a further integration into the system. The antithesis of capitalism generates a new synthesis of capitalism. Just as you can now buy marks on Amazon, manufactured in a non-unionized production network and sent to your door by a worker without any ownership of the van or instruments of his labor. The critique of capitalism itself is now produced and delivered utilizing everything Marx is criticizing, in Marcuse's words.
Contemporary society seems to be capable of containing social change. Qualitative change, which would establish essentially different institutions, a new direction of the productive process, new modes of human existence. This containment of social change is perhaps the most singular achievement of advanced industrial society. The general acceptance of the national purpose, bipartisan policy, the decline of pluralism, the collusion of business and labor within the strong state testify to the integration of opposites, which is the result as well as the prerequisite of this achievement.
This cultural reconciliation diminishes the critical role of literature and art, which traditionally served to reveal and challenge societal contradictions. It's very much what happened to the hippies and the 60s movement. A kind of indifference to its ideas developed, and the music, aesthetics, and counterculture drug lifestyle was no longer transgressive and critical, but became another commodity, and a Halloween costume denatured of all its potent terror to normative life. More recently, we watched this happen with rap, which started as being critical of the ghetto lifestyle many low-income black men grew up in, and the oppressive conditions which a system had created for them. We listened to NWA to hear their critique and were terrified of the culture. Now, however, rap culture is as much a part of capitalism as Walmart. The rapper is someone who pulls themselves up by their bootstraps, who through hard work and tireless dedication achieves the American dream. 50 Cent and Bill Gates live by the same motto, get rich or die trying. The subtext being capitalism is liberating, there is no need to be critical of it as a possible cause of oppression. This is a feature of totalitarianism according to Marcuse, where it is capable of harmonizing pluralism,
where the most contradictory works and truths peacefully coexist in indifference. Prior to the advent of this cultural reconciliation, literature and art were essentially alienation, sustaining and protecting the contradiction, the unhappy consciousness of the divided world, the defeated possibilities, the hopes unfulfilled, and the promises betrayed. They were a rational, cognitive force, revealing a dimension of man and nature which was repressed and repelled in reality.
Other arts like cinema seem critical of the system but end up being subverted by it rather than showing alternative aspirations and desires. Scarface is the exact same narrative as the conservative myth of the self-made man, an immigrant who comes to America and through grit and business acumen achieves all that America has to offer, the house, the cars, the women. It couldn't be more capitalist than Gordon Gekko's greed is good speech. Every rebellious 13-year-old boy has a t-shirt or poster of Scarface, not realizing he's as transgressive as if he had one of Reagan. Star Wars had Vader as the epitome of a man who lost himself to this totalitarian system of technologically enhanced, ruthless pursuit of power and efficiency as an end in itself, enslaved to the will and appetite for endless control. Now Vader, rather than be a critique of technological totalitarianisms and a symbol of its terror, is part of promoting the very machine of corporate expansion to all avenues of our lives, the colonializing our imagination and leisure time with passive consumerism. These symbols lose their critical and transgressive power, getting retconned into new frameworks which castrate their power. This cultural reconciliation diminishes the critical role of literature and art, which traditionally serve to reveal and challenge societal contradictions. Instead, these forms of expression become tools that sustain the status quo, masking the underlying alienation and pacifying the unfulfilled potential of individuals.
But art has this magic power only as the power of negation. It can speak its own language only as long as the images are alive which refuse and refute the established order.
The left today seems to have lost touch with its critique of the established order, especially in corporate life. Muted are the voices of Occupy Wall Street or left-wing critiques by figures like Noam Chomsky, who considered the corporation to be a fascist lifestyle where the corporation's goals of market line go up governs all one's time, energy, and attention, where the individual is expendable and only has an identity in how they serve the corporation, which replaces the nation in fascists' nationalism. These corporations themselves are transnational and more like feudal powers. They operate at the service of no country, creed, or religion, but for their own banner alone. The whole structure of this corporate totalitarianism is efficiency and profit. The left, who sees themselves as the vanguard against the rise of fascism, are quite content working within these exceptionally fascistic systems. These were the ideas of the radical left, before woke sucked the air out of the room and somehow convinced a generation that hyper-mono-optic fixation on race and sexuality was revolutionary thinking. The left will go on about how rich white men rule America, about the 1%, but who are the 1% of the top billionaires in America? Of the top 10 billionaires, about 80% of them are liberal. Conservatives with Musk having $269.8 billion, Larry Ellison $212.2 billion, and Michael Dell $104.8 billion, control around $600 billion. While liberals have Bezos with $200 billion, Mark Zuckerberg $196.4 billion, Warren Buffett $144.0 billion, Larry Page $135.6 billion, Sergey Brin $129.9 billion, Steve Ballmer $124.2 billion, Bill Gates, $105.1 billion. Michael Bloomberg, $104.7 billion together. They control about $1.4 trillion in capital, 2x that of conservatives, and putting the liberal in neoliberal capitalism. Meanwhile, women have been recently finding employment in major six-figure jobs, while men have consistently been more unemployed, and women tend more to vote Democrat. So the free market is increasingly becoming a market governed by liberal control of capital and consumption. The left are the capitalists, the bourgeoisie class in America. They can no longer be relied on to critique or reform labor, since they have become the ones most interested in conserving these trends. Any revolutionary spirit in the left has in turn been subjected to containment of effecting any social change, and been deflected by the neoliberal left into social issues like LGBTQ and abortion. Liberation no longer means liberation from the all-pervasive rule of capitalism that Marx fought, nor the liberation of creative energies from a service to market forces to live richer lives within local communities. It means more OnlyFans and rainbows. Left-wing woke capitalism is just such an integration of opposites. The social justice zealots are part of creating social injustice. They, like the hippies, have become conscripted into perpetuating the same forces and systems which felicitated what they claim they are the opposition towards. Slavery in the 1800s was part of the free market. Woke does not boycott or cancel Apple or Hershey for their labor practices. In fact, Apple is held as a symbol of progressivism, because they do the gestures and say the line. Woke accepts the labor conditions. It does not concern itself fighting that it's the use of the N-word that is immoral, or that today people have prejudices which could cause inequality in getting a job. The problem with a male-dominated workforce in the 1900s for woke isn't how terrible it was to work in a factory. It was that women couldn't work in them too. The work conditions of the 1900s are of little interest for critique, only that women were kept from having as much buying power as men. And corporate crony capitalism, which turned American politics into corporately owned public servants, barely gets a mention by woke. The left went from Bernie Sanders in 2016 and occupying Wall Street to making sure Wall Street had rainbow flags. Woke is just another example of this containment. It's a diversion of revolutionary energy and attention away from qualitative change in new production processes or modes of human existence. It's like the 60s mission for all these goals got sidetracked by side quests. And now it's assumed that until all the side quests are finished, we can't return to the main mission. These issues have been ginned up as essential to a revolution, while no one even knows what the revolution even is anymore. It's been flattened into boring bathroom and cake debates and sold at Target with all the other basic bitch kit. When conservatives talk of Marcuse today, they see him as one of the founders of cultural Marxism. And I do agree that he argues for a cultural shift as a way to create a revolution, but his revolution was in opposition to this affluent society and totalitarianism of standardized behaviors and thinking that technology was enabling. His cultural Marxism is not the woke or current culture war Marxism obsessed with sexual and racial identities. He was in opposition to drugs and sex of the hippies of his day. His major works were written during a time when the concept of transgender identity was not widely recognized or discussed in academic or political discourse. John Money, the founder of gender theory, began publishing in 1955 and in the 60s, while the distinction between sex and gender was not made till Stoller's 1968 book, Sex and Gender. Marcuse wrote One-Dimensional Man in 1964, 4 years before gender was made a concept from sex. And before that, his first major book, Eros and Civilization, where he writes on sexuality, was written in 1955. His focus when talking about sexuality was on critiques of advanced industrial society, repression, and the possibilities for liberation following Freud. Such a thread, I would argue, gender theory cannot integrate, since concepts that Freudianism uses, principles like the Oedipus complex and Electra complex, depend on the psychological significance of masculine and femininity structuring our psyche in order to explain the human person. His whole model of a paternal superego falls apart without masculinity having a distinct essential content which is universally experienced. Judith Butler used psychoanalysis via Lacan in the 90s, and it's through Judith Butler that the Frankfurt School gets retrofitted to gender theory. She uses Marcuse's critique of normativity, the ways in which capitalist societies enforce conformity through cultural and social repression, which she extended to gender norms. However, this extension could have been done without deconstructing and reducing gender to nothing but social constructs. We can say that society enforces certain gender behaviors without erasing women the way gender theory does. While in whole, Freud works from heterosexual assumptions and puts emphasis on binary oppositions like male, female, and heterosexual, homosexual. Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, a prominent figure in queer theory, critiqued this aspect of Freud. I think because Marcuse influenced latter figures like Butler that conservatives too hastily reject him. It's like he examined how gas cars worked and another group took that info and started making car bombs. Therefore, he was part of creating car bombs. In fact, Marcuse is very effective as a critique against the left because he exposes how divergent today's left is from the 60s left. This is not to promote the right, but to return to the fundamentals of the left. The left today is a mutation of its former self, a sloppy mess of degenerated thinking, especially in comparison to figures like Marcuse, Adorno, Fromm, and Lacan. That the woke left is not cultural Marxism because it's not worthy of association to the level of thinkers in the Frankfurt School. It is a farce of this school of Marxism, and the tragedy of the hippies' failures is repeating itself in it and taking any real oppositional energy within the left against totalitarianism with it. Marcuse is way more revolutionary than woke will ever be. They serve the very totalitarianism he was fighting, and they only superficially use some of his ideas like normativity, and when they do, it's in a distorted form that sees heterosexuality as part of some oppressive power structure rather than as a biological imperative for 95% of the population. They have actively served the process of containment by doing so, deconstituting the ideas of the 60s from its spirit, stripping those ideas of anything profound and reconstituting them into genital-centric pseudo-intellectualism. More postmodern sophistry about power relations using the simulacrum of critical thought to prevent any critical thought of their ideas. The liberty of civil rights has been constricted to a liberty of genitalia proclivities, while the hopes and aspirations of the human spirit are degraded to endless chatter about genitalia impulses. These impulses are supposed to be nucleus to liberating human potential and thus social progress, as if the thing stopping utopia is not enough promiscuity and non-procreative forms of sex. Marcuse was advocating for the return to something sacred, work as art, and the creation of art as a revolutionary act. Something which is set apart from the profane, from the all-encompassing systemization of life, eroticism, time, and energy by a consumer society. Woke wants to conserve this totalitarian society. It wants standardized behavior and thinking using technology, but just change who controls it. They want domination of the system, not revolution of it. Unfortunately, I don't think such a revolution like Marcuse's is possible without at the same time a return to the transcendental, the sacred found in religion. His Marxism also holds him back. He wants to reinvent heaven and create the sacred within a materialist paradigm. But religion and its metaphysics are best suited to set certain acts and elements outside the totality of the profane. To anchor why not everything can be commodified, and why work needs to be nested in some larger economy of meaning besides consumerism. Marcuse is an effective tool of critique, but I'm not sure he has an effective vision for finding our way out of this. Yet he also seems to recognize this as part of the problem. We can't think outside the box from within the box. Are we, as Marcuse suggests, just buying new transient pleasures as to make our life palatable? Is consumerism itself an opiate and the reason we are unable to create a different society? New patterns of life or a more productive economy than a consumer economy is that we are hopelessly addicted and can no longer endure life without that opioid. And I say hopeless not to be hyperbolic, but because can we even imagine life any longer without this form of capitalism? Can we even imagine new, more satisfying ways of living our lives which we could formulate as goals to work towards? Or are we like an alcoholic, barely able to imagine getting through the day without a drink and finding the prospect of a life of never having another drink terrifying? Do we lack the vital energies to actually produce new hopes? Are we so de-sublimated as to not even know how to desire our own desires, living exhausted and strung out on consumerism? Is a period of asceticism necessary first? A monastic purge required before we can reimagine what the good life would look like now that we have mastered the ability to satisfy all our material needs? Provide feedback in the comments. What do you think? Is America a totalitarian system? How do we improve work to make it more meaningful? Is the woke left part of the problem? Also, I make these using in video. I had been a long-time consumer of YouTube and thought often of the things I could do or how I could do what some other creator was doing better. In video got me past that stalling. I use it to do all the voice and much of the B-roll, which allows me to focus on the writing and philosophy of my videos. If you have essays you would like to transform into video, in video is a good way to get started. Just take something you've already written, put it into the script setting, and it will give you the voice and video. It's free for shorter videos, and if you decide to make longer ones, see my affiliate link for some kind of perk. Even if you don't use it, it's still worthwhile using this or another AI service like it to get involved in producing thought-out content and formulating your own ideas in writing, rather than just passively consuming everything that floats through the stream of culture uncritically. After all, thought is the most revolutionary act.
Do 'em like the red carpet and we'll lay 'em out. Bitch, I'm lean nasty, I don't